breaking news for your home. Wayday! Wayfair's big sale is almost here, and you can score the best deals in home. Like up to 80% off everything home. Yes, you heard that right. 80% off with free shipping on everything. Plus surprise flash deals all Wayday long. We're talking outdoor furniture and essentials, rugs, and more. All at Wayfair, and all up to 80% off during Wayday. Shop Wayfair's Wayday from April 25th through 27th.
Wayfair, every style, every home.
History as it happens, March 27, 2026. Regime change, Israel and Lebanon, 1982.
The Israeli armed forces have completed preparations for a military attack into Lebanon.
To detach Syrian support from the PLO.
What is at stake now in the invasion of Lebanon is the future of Lebanon itself.
But this army is beyond government control. It is an illegal militia.
This council has treated with callousness and indifference all these years all our complaints with regard to PLO barbarism originating from Lebanon against Israel's civilians.
The legitimate security concerns of neighboring states, including particularly the safety of Israel's northern population, must be provided for. But this is not a difficult task if the political will is there.
And all the problems we left without any solution since 1943 until now led us to where we are.
Israel is at war in Lebanon again, displacing 1 million Lebanese from their homes in the southern part of the country in the latest attempt to disarm Hezbollah. But this new war is part of a long pattern stretching back decades, where Israel repeatedly tried and failed to create a Lebanon it could control. Once that meant picking the country's president. That's next as we report history as it happens. I'm Martin DeCaro.
A massive bomb in the floor just above the flat where he was giving a speech in Ashrafia, which is a neighborhood in Beirut, and he was assassinated. Nothing was left of him. He was identified by the wedding ring. His finger was found with a wedding ring, and his advisor, Akradoni, said, "Oh, this is the finger of Bashir Gemayel."
Lebanon was important to the early Zionists because of the Litani River. Today, the State of Israel has destroyed the bridges across the Litani as its military goes to war again, trying to solve its security problems on the other side of the Blue Line. As Lubna Elamin writes in the New York Review of Books, since Monday, March 2nd, Israel's armed forces have launched daily airstrikes on Lebanon, begun after Hezbollah fired a small volley of rockets into Israel in response to the killing of Ali Khamenei, causing no casualties. The Israeli strikes have so far killed more than 900 people and displaced more than 1 million out of a population of less than 6 million. Evacuation orders have been issued for almost the whole of the southern suburbs of Beirut, she says. The evacuation order for the country's south keeps expanding, its northern boundary moving up within 10 days from the Litani River to the Zahrani River, around 25 miles from the Israeli border. Israel significantly expanded its ground invasion of the south, raising the threat of a long-term occupation. The strikes have also, without prior warning, targeted areas far from the evacuation zones, including the campus of the public Lebanese University in Beirut, where, she says, Israel assassinated 2 science professors, a seafront area where refugees were sleeping, killing 8, and buildings in the mountains overlooking Beirut, where the victims included a children's book author and a photographer along with his toddler.
Something familiarly awful is happening here. The sound of jets above and the near constant noise of bombardment, just another reason why towns like here in Nabatea and the south of Lebanon in general emptying out.
So many people had to flee, she says, that journeys that normally take 2 or 3 hours took 20 or more. The hundreds of thousands who have now left their homes have gone north, sheltering with relatives in schools, on the pavements, in public squares, and in cars. In the recent rains, the makeshift tents have flooded. The displaced have been trying to guess from the location of the ceaseless strikes whether their homes still stand. Most will not know before they return, but they do not know when that'll be. The evacuation orders are open-ended. And I will share a link to that essay in the show notes to this episode. Today's enemy is Hezbollah, the Shia militia that was spawned by Israel's invasion of Lebanon back in 1982.
What is at stake now in the invasion of Lebanon is the future of Lebanon itself, its territorial integrity, its independence, and its sovereignty. This must be preserved, and it is the responsibility of the Council, under the Charter, to prevent a member state from being literally murdered. We bring this urgent appeal to the Security Council in the most urgent terms.
At that time, the enemy was the PLO. In addition to the military goal of routing the PLO bases in southern Lebanon, the Israelis sought a political solution if they could somehow install a friendly government in Beirut, led by someone who also opposed the PLO presence in the shattered country. His name was Bashir Gemayel, a Maronite Christian and the leader of the brutal Phalange militia. Here is Gemayel being interviewed in a documentary that aired on British television in 1982, discussing the problem of foreign interference in his country's affairs.
We thought that by avoiding the problems, we will solve them. We never understood, Christians and Muslims, that all the problems we were trying today to avoid were kept aside, but they were growing. And a day came where we were not able anymore to withhold all these problems. The Syrians and the Palestinians have helped us to blow up everything, and all the problems we left without any solution since 1943 until now led us to where we are.
In his epic account of the Civil War, Pity the Nation, the late journalist Robert Fisk wrote of the Israeli-Gemayel marriage, the Israelis followed one consistent practice. They never called the Phalange by its real name. They called it the Lebanese Forces, a coalition that had no real meaning now that the Phalangist alliance with Israel had been consecrated around West Beirut. If the Israelis had called their allies Phalangists, of course, it would have raised awkward questions. Thoughts would have traveled not forward into the future of the prosperous friendship of Jew and Christian Maronite, but backwards to 1936, to those young men in their dark shirts who had paraded for their youth leader at Ain al-Rumane. Any repeated mention of the Phalange would have evoked memories of Franco, of fascism, and of Nazism. Fisk goes on to say, on August 23, 1982, the Maronites celebrated the fruit of their alliance with Israel, the election of Bashir Gemayel as president of Lebanon. There is no surprise, he writes. By now his elevation was assured. He was Israel's man. Again, Robert Fisk in Pity the Nation. The Israeli-Gemayel marriage did not last. A Syrian agent blew up Gemayel on September 14, 1982, just 2 weeks after the PLO had completed its evacuation and after President Reagan had said the U.S. Marines would come home. Gemayel's assassination triggered one of the ugliest episodes in the history of the modern Middle East, the massacres at the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps.
Good evening. Gunmen have marauded through 2 Palestinian refugee camps in West Beirut, executing unarmed men, women, and children in a bloody massacre which has heightened tensions between the U.S. and Israel.
My fellow Americans, the scenes that the whole world witnessed this past weekend were among the most heartrending in the long nightmare of Lebanon's agony. Millions of us have seen pictures of the Palestinian victims of this tragedy. There's little that words can add. But there are actions we can and must take to bring that nightmare to an end.
After this nightmare abated, Israel wound up staying in Lebanon for 18 years, withdrawing finally from occupied southern Lebanon in 2000. Today, more than a quarter century later, its armies are once more trying to create a Lebanon it can control. Ahron Bregman was an IDF officer in 1982. Today, he's a historian at King's College London and the author of Israel's Wars, A History Since 1947, which he is updating for a 5th edition. Tap subscribe now in the show notes to skip ads, enjoy early access and all of our bonus content, or go to historyasithappens.com. Welcome back, my friend.
Hello, Martin. Good to see you again.
You were in Israel when the war broke out. Briefly tell us what that was like.
Yes, well, I was there to investigate, research a new chapter for my book, Israel's Wars. It was supposed to be a chapter on the Gaza war, and I found myself in the shelter in a new war, and it was quite tough, I must say, because we spent a lot of time in the shelters in Israel, at least 3 times a night. We had to get out of bed and rush to the shelter, which was very unpleasant.
Did you ever feel like your life was in danger?
Only once, because as long as these were missiles coming from Iran, we had about 9 minutes to reach the shelter. So you have 9 minutes, they give you a warning, you have 9 minutes, and then you go down when the siren is in the air. But when one missile came from Hezbollah, and because the distance is so short, you don't have time to rush to the shelter. You get the warning, you start running, and then you see, you can hear the big boom in the air. So it was quite an unpleasant experience, I must say, because by now I've forgotten my days, my Lebanon days, you see.
So, despite what I might think, Ahron Bregman, not everyone listens to every one of my episodes. And besides, I have new listeners now who may not be aware that we spoke a couple of years ago about Israel and Lebanon, and that you were a soldier in the IDF in the 1982 invasion. Tell us about your involvement in that war and how it changed you as a human being.
Well, I was an artillery officer in 1982, and when it started in June the 6th, I was somewhere near Tel Aviv. I was not in my unit any longer, but it sounds crazy now, but I just did not want to miss the war. And therefore, I jumped into a car with a friend of mine, and we crossed into Lebanon. And in the morning, we reached central Lebanon in a place near Bahamdun, where there was an artillery unit, and I stayed with them for a while. And then I got a new job in Beirut as an artillery officer. So I spent the rest of the time in Beirut. We were in a building together with the Phalange, with Bashir Gemayel's people, and I'm sure that we will mention it later. But the war was quite a shocking experience for me, because like the war with Iran now, it was a war of choice. It was not a war of necessity. And therefore, after a while, you or I started asking questions about the Lebanon war. After the war, I just decided to leave the military, and I went to uni, and the rest is history.
Now, you did not want to be part of the Israeli occupation forces in the Palestinian territories, right?
Oh, that's very true. This came later in 1987, when the first Palestinian uprising, the so-called Intifada, started. I refused to serve in the occupied territories. And because Israel is such a small community, or it used to be a small community, and everyone knew about everything, I prefer to leave Israel. And that's the reason why I'm in the United Kingdom now, for many years now, because it felt that it would be better for me to leave Israel than to stay there at the time. This was in 1987, back in 1987, yeah.
And the 1982 war lasted 3 months, although you could say it never really ended. It is part of a longer pattern that we're going to discuss here. You mentioned the current war of choice in Iran. Israel is also fighting another war, or another front in this war, in Lebanon as we speak, where 1 million people, Lebanese, have been displaced from their homes in the southern part of the country adjacent to Israel. And the pattern is Israel attempting to shape the political environment, the security environment in Lebanon over the decades through use of military force, and it failing over and over again. I mean, would you agree with that, given what's happening today?
Yes, Lebanon is a complex and complicated place, and whenever you go there, or whenever the Israelis go there, it starts well, it ends in tears. You mentioned the first Lebanon war. You know, Martin, it was supposed to last between 48 and 72 hours. It lasted 18 years. It continues now, of course, in another shape.
That's right. Israel I shouldn't say Israel got stuck. It decided to occupy Lebanon for all those years up to 1990. Or no, 2000.
Up to 24th of May 2000. So when Israel went to Lebanon on the 6th of June 1982, some of the ministers who approved the war believe that it will last between 48 and 72 hours.
Long columns of Israeli tanks and armored personnel carriers loaded with infantry rolled over the border into southern Lebanon this morning. The Israeli military spokesman said that they would seek out and destroy all the Palestinian terrorist concentrations and artillery positions that have sent a rain of rockets and shells into Israeli border communities in the past few days.
It took a long time for the Israelis to get out. And guess what? Now they are going back into exactly the same area.
Not for regime change. The idea in 82 was regime change, although Israel is trying to effect some kind of regime change or collapse in Iran. All right, so before we get to 1982, let's establish a little context. Really, you can go back to 1948. You can find Israeli military figures believing Israel should control southern Lebanon, even make that part of the world part of Israel, all the way up to the Litani River. What is the historical context there? Why that part of Lebanon? Why should it have been part of Israel in the eyes of people like David Ben-Gurion?
Well, this is really a good start, I think, for the discussion, because people don't realize that even before the establishment of the State of Israel on Friday, the 14th of May, 1948, the early Zionists, those who wanted to establish a Hebrew, not a Jewish, a Hebrew state in Palestine, they put pressure on the French and on the British that the northern border of Israel will be the Litani River. So it is not only Ben-Gurion in 1947-48, but we are talking about early Zionists. And the main thing for the early Zionists and for Ben-Gurion too was water. Because if you see the Litani River, and I saw the Litani River and I swam in the Litani River, I had a shower, not a shower, but I jumped into the Litani River, and you see how fresh the water is, healthy water. And what the Jews, the early Zionists, and later Ben-Gurion wanted to have was basically to divert some of the water of the Litani River to the east, to connect it to the Hasbani River to the east. You look at the map later, Martin, and then from the Hasbani River to take it down to the Jordan River. So basically Litani, Hasbani, Jordan River, and down to the Negev, to the desert. And in 1948, moving forward, in Operation Hiram, Israeli forces, in fact, did reach the Litani River. If you look at the map, there is a L shape there, a bend in the river, in the Litani River. The Israeli forces reached this point, but in 1949, they retreated from there. And then the Israeli dream, this is my last point about it, the Israeli dream of having the river as part of Israel came to an end in 1955. In 1955, the American administration sent someone by the name of Eric Johnston, and he dealt with water in the Middle East, how to allocate water between Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, Syria, and this was basically the end of the Israeli dream to have access to the water of the Litani River. And if I may, Martin, just one more comment. Today, I heard one of the Israeli ministers talking about the Litani River, and it reminds me the dream of the Israelis until 1955 of having access to the water of the river.
And just to cite a academic paper I found here by Jalal Halwani of Lebanese University. He goes back to, as you say, early 20th century. Israeli interest in the waters of Lebanon go back at least as far as the Paris Peace Conference, 1919, when Chaim Weizmann, head of the World Zionist Organization, wrote to the British Prime Minister David Lloyd George that Lebanon was well-watered and that the Litani was valueless to the territory north of the proposed frontiers. They can be used beneficially in the country much further south. He concluded the Litani was essential to the future of the Jewish national home, but this suggestion was rejected by the League of Nations, and the Litani was confirmed as part of Lebanon. Who knows, maybe if a different decision had been made 100 years ago, we wouldn't be dealing with some of the problems today, or maybe not. The security picture begins to develop in the 1960s, and that is because the PLO guerrillas start to move into Lebanon. And after 1970, especially, Ahron, when the PLO is thrown out of Jordan during Black September, southern Lebanon now becomes the PLO's new base. Why don't you pick it up from there and how that sets the stage, if you will, for what happens in 1982?
Basically, the PLO, after the 1967 war, the 1967-60 war, was based in Jordan. In September 1970, they tried to challenge the king of Jordan, and then he just threw them out.
It was these Palestinians, after the Arab rout in the Six-Day War, these Fedayeen who picked up the fallen Arab banner. They vowed vengeance. While the armies of Egypt, Syria, Jordan reeled from their humiliation by the Israelis, the Palestinians began to train again, became the vanguard of a slowly reawakened Arab pride, folk heroes in the Arab world.
And they moved to Lebanon. They deployed, the PLO, they deployed in southern Lebanon along the border with Israel. The commanders, the leaders, including Arafat and others, based themselves in Beirut. And part of Lebanon came under the full control. In other words, for example, in Beirut, in the 1970s, you needed to cross PLO roadblocks because they were in full control of some of the neighborhoods there.
It was a state within a state, right?
Exactly, a state within a state, both in the south, along the border with Israel, in the area of Nabatea, which is a place in Lebanon, and also in Beirut. So the PLO is basically up in Beirut and in the south, and some sections of Lebanon are under the full control. They have, if you want, their own capital in the Lebanese capital.
And there was something called the Cairo Agreement of 1969, in which the Lebanese government turned over the supervision of the Palestinian refugee camps to the PLO in exchange for the PLO pledging to obtain government consent for any armed incursions it might make into Israel. But that did not happen.
It did not happen, but it is interesting if we look at it from another perspective, because in Lebanon, then and now, you've always had armed groups which worked sometimes in contradiction to the interests of the state. At the time, it was the PLO carrying guns and doing things against Israel, and then Israel retaliating against the government of Lebanon. And now, while we are talking, you have Hezbollah carrying guns, challenging Israel, and Israel is bombing Lebanon. Nothing has changed, Martin. Nothing has changed in the last 50, 60, 70 years.
Well, the names change, right? But the underlying issues, in this case, Israel's security, the political crisis in Lebanon, which you could say is a failed state to this day, does not have full control over its national territory.
This is the tragedy of Lebanon, because I don't know if you've been there, Martin.
I haven't, no.
I was there in 1978 during the Litani campaign and then later in the Lebanon war. It's a beautiful country with a beautiful people, but it is the battleground for other armies and people and groups, Syrians, Israelis, PLO, Palestinians. Everyone is fighting in this land with the Lebanese government having very little control.
From 1970 onward, the cycle of Palestinian raids into Israel and Israeli retaliation in force repeated itself countless times. So, Ahron, at this time, the PLO, people might be asking, well, why were Palestinian guerrillas in Lebanon repeatedly attacking into Israel? At this stage, the PLO is still trying to defeat Israel, right? Reclaim the entire territory.
That's correct. What the PLO is doing after the 1967 war is trying to liberate Palestine. It sounds crazy, I know, but until 1967, they trusted Arab armies to do the job for them. 1967 didn't happen. They take matters into their own hands, and they decide to liberate Palestine. They do it from Jordan first until they are kicked out from there in Black September. Then they do it from Lebanon, and they do it in line with their charter, which was issued in July 1968, which called for armed struggle to liberate Palestine. The problem is that they are operating from countries, from Jordan first and from Lebanon then, and the Israelis, in their response, respond not only against the PLO, but also against the governments of Jordan and Lebanon.
Sure. And a lot of the shelling displaced very poor Shia farmers and others from southern Lebanon, and they moved to slums outside Beirut, and that is where Hezbollah would begin to recruit its first members. We'll get to that in a little bit. Ahron, how did this conflict, the PLO guerrillas and the Israeli army, how did that contribute to the start of the civil war in Lebanon, which broke out in 1975?
You see, there were tensions already there at the time between the different groups in Lebanon. What complicated the matter was outside forces. Israel, on the one hand, Syria, on the other hand, became involved in the internal problems of Lebanon. The Israelis worked with the Maronite. The Maronites are the largest Christian group in Lebanon. The Maronites, one of their representatives, met with a Mossad agent. I'm talking about 1975. You mentioned 1975. They met on the stairs of the Madeleine Church in Paris. And the Maronites asked the Israelis to help them. And the Israelis thought, the Maronites are going to fight against the PLO in Lebanon. Why shouldn't we help them? And this was the beginning of the involvement of Israel in this civil war.
Yeah, strange bedfellows, because when al-Assad, the father, the dictator of Syria, decides to intervene in the civil war and occupy part of Lebanon in 1976, is doing so on behalf of the Maronites in the civil war against the interests of the PLO. So that was strange. Before we go any further, I just want to encourage all of our listeners. We're not going to cover all the complexities of Lebanon's sectarian divisions and the feelings of resentment and disenfranchisement on the part of the Shia Muslims in Lebanon who felt solidarity with the PLO against the Christian sects and the Christian militias who had a majority based on, a very old division of power in the Lebanese government based on population. The Muslims by this point were a majority, but the Christians still had the majority in the Lebanese government. I'm just going to encourage everyone to read an encyclopedia article, something brief that'll give you the broad contours of the Lebanese civil war. We're going to touch on it continually here, but it is an enormous subject and we would spend all day in 1975 and we'd never move on. So by the early 1980s, Ahron, Israel's just simply had enough of this situation, right? And they're looking for an opportunity to solve, there's an echo today in the headlines, solve the problem of security in Lebanon, right?
Martin, in the early 1980s, I was an officer in the Israeli army. We were sitting on our tanks, in my case, on my cannon, and we were just waiting for the opportunity to move in. We just waited for something to happen that will send us into Lebanon because we were ready. We knew that it was coming. We just needed an excuse to get in. And the excuse came from London. It came from London. On the 3rd of June, 1982, Palestinians belonging to the Abu Nidal group jumped on the Israeli ambassador when he left the Dorchester Hotel in Park Lane in London and tried to kill him. And the Israeli prime minister of the time, Begin, said, well, an attack on an ambassador equivalent to an attack on a state. And we are going into Lebanon. Yeah. This was the trigger that sent us into Lebanon in 1982.
And on June 6, 1982, PLO mortar and rocket attacks against settlements in the Galilee sector of northern Israel also provided a pretext. I neglected to mention, Ahron, that in 1978, Israel briefly invaded Lebanon, And William Cleveland, in his excellent reference book, A History of the Modern Middle East, he says the Israelis took 2 lessons away from that very brief invasion, which came to an end when the United Nations and the United States, more importantly, pressured Israel to withdraw. The first lesson was the presence of the Palestinian guerrillas could not be eliminated by military action that confined itself to southern Lebanon alone, meaning below the Litani River. And second, the influence of the Palestinians in Lebanese affairs could not be eradicated without resolving the broader issue of Lebanon's political instability.
That's very true, Martin. And in fact, I was there. This was my first visit to Lebanon, the so-called Litani campaign. We invaded South Lebanon, moved up to the Litani River, and stopped. And it is very interesting what you've just mentioned, because we met very little resistance. The PLO saw us coming, and they just moved north of the Litani River. But this Litani campaign was the first time that I was there inside Lebanon, the first time that I tried eating cherries, because our battalion was deployed. We were artillery inside cherry trees orchard or whatever it was. It was March or April 1978. And one more historical point, Martin. The Litani campaign was relatively short, and the ministers who would approve going into Lebanon in 1982 had in mind the Litani campaign, and they thought, our operation in Lebanon 1982 will be short because it's going to be just like the Litani campaign. They got it wrong, of course.
And the goal was regime change. So let's investigate then why the Israeli cabinet in 1982, a fellow by the name of Ariel Sharon was there. Menachem Begin was the prime minister, why they believe they were able to accomplish something like this. So they wanted to rout the PLO in southern Lebanon, drive them out of the country or defeat them, drive all the way to Beirut, lay siege to the capital city, where of course there'd be terrible harm to civilians, and install a Maronite Christian. You mentioned the Maronites before. They were the largest Christian or the most powerful Christian sect. They had their own militias. Pretty much every political body in Lebanon had militias during this period. There weren't conventional armies fighting on battlefields in the civil war. It was a lot of militias. Bashir Gemayel was the younger son of Pierre Gemayel, who was the founder and titular leader of the Phalangists. They had a vicious reputation as a Christian militia. How did Israel become interested in Bashir Gemayel?
So I think that I touched upon it before, but I'll explain again. In 1975, his people, one of his people, Joseph something, I can't remember, I interviewed him many years after that. He met with a Mossad agent in Paris, and he asked for the Israelis in the Madeleine church, on the stairs they met, and he asked for the Israelis to help. And the government of Israel at the time was led by Rabin. It was not a Likud government. It was a Labour government. Rabin was the prime minister, and Peres was one of his ministers, I can't remember. And the Israelis decided to start helping them. And they started to provide them with weapons and to train them. And this was the beginning of the relationship. And then came 1982, the war, fast forward to 1982. And yes, you're right. What the Israelis wanted to do in this war, or what Ariel Sharon wanted to do in this war, was many things: to defeat the Syrians, to defeat the PLO. But the most interesting thing, Martin, was the aim of crowning Bashir Gemayel, a Maronite leader, as the president of Lebanon. You crown him, and he will reward you by signing a peace treaty with you. And then Lebanon will be the second country to be in peace with Israel. That was the most important part of the plan, to crown a new president in Lebanon. And it partly worked.
What was in it for Gemayel, other than obviously becoming president? But
let me describe it through my personal eyes. You see, in Beirut, we stayed in a school near the presidential palace in Beirut. We, the Israelis, were in the first floor, and Bashir Gemayel was in the ground floor. I could see him coming and going. I could see him from the window, Bashir Gemayel, because his people were in the first floor. He needed, Martin, 2/3 of the Lebanese parliament to vote for him, to become a president. And the elections took place, I think, on the 22nd of August, 1982. He promised us, the officers of the first floor, if I'm elected, I'll take you to Casino du Liban in June, and we will celebrate together. And we, not me personally, but I was there. I was the Forrest Gump of the Lebanon war. I was witnessing it from the side. He needed 2/3 of the parliament, and the Israelis blocked those who opposed him and helicoptered those who supported him, helicopter to Beirut.
Wow.
And he was elected president of Lebanon. And guess what? He took us to Casino du Liban. We drove there at night to Junia, and there was a big restaurant there. Bashir Gemayel came and gave a speech in French. He was French educated. He talked to us. He said, "Thank you for helping me to be elected." So he was elected on the 22nd, I think, and he was supposed to walk into the parliament 4 weeks later. But 2 weeks later, he was assassinated.
Meanwhile, the number of dead and injured in yesterday's explosion, which killed President-elect Bashir Gemayel, has reportedly reached at least 60. No one yet has claimed responsibility for the bombing. Lebanon has begun 7 days of mourning for Gemayel. Shops were closed. Usually crowded streets were nearly empty. He was buried in his hometown mountain village of Bekfaya this afternoon. Among those attending was U.S. Presidential Envoy Morris Draper, who has returned to the Middle East to continue.
Someone put a massive bomb in the floor just above the flat where he was giving a speech in Ashrafia, which is a neighborhood in Beirut, and he was assassinated. Nothing was left of him. He was identified by the wedding ring. His finger was found with a wedding ring, and his advisor, Akradoni, said, "Oh, this is the finger of Bashir Gemayel, or this is the wedding ring of Bashir Gemayel." He was assassinated.
The conversation continues. Tap subscribe now in the show notes to skip ads, enjoy early access, and all of our bonus content. I want to stay on what the Israeli objectives were here, too. By achieving all these goals in Lebanon, it would isolate the Palestinians on the West Bank, leading to possible annexation. There's another echo in the headlines today. The West Bank is being annexed de facto, if not de jure, right now as Israel wages another war against Hezbollah in Lebanon. But that was a goal even then, Begin and the settler movement. You see the origins of it in the 80s.
Another goal of the Lebanon war, of course, was to attack the PLO, to push them out of Lebanon into Jordan, in fact. In the end, they went to Tunisia, never mind now. But the original idea of the Begin government was to push them into Jordan, and Jordan will become Palestine. It is very simple. The vast majority of the people in Jordan at the time, 71% were Palestinians. So the people were Palestinians. And it will also solve the problem of the capital, because the Palestinians will not ask to have Jerusalem, because Amman is already the capital of Jordan.
Sure. But the Israeli War Cabinet misled the world on this. Right? They didn't announce ahead of time we're going in to install Gemayel, right? Going all the way to Beirut took the world by surprise. Is that right?
The person who misled everyone was Ariel Sharon, probably with Begin, the prime minister. They probably worked together. There is a debate how much Begin actually knew. The ministers themselves who approved the 1982 war knew nothing or very little, or understood very little about what's happening. They thought it's going to be as short as the Litani campaign. But Sharon, and probably Begin with him, misled the world, yes, because the objectives were big: to crown a new president, to get rid of the PLO, and to attack the Syrians. There were Syrian forces in Lebanon. So there was a big plan there. It was called Oranim Gadol. There was Oranim Katan, small pines, up to the Litani River, and Oranim Gadol, big pines, up to Beirut. This was big pine.
Thank you for the Hebrew lesson here, too, Ahron.
Yeah.
So Menachem Begin arrived in Washington during the war in the summer of '82, and I'm going to play you what he said when he was standing with Ronald Reagan and was asked a couple of questions by reporters about what the heck was going on in Lebanon.
I have read in some newspapers in this great country that Israel invaded Lebanon. This is a misnomer. Israel did not invade any country. You do invade a land when you want to conquer it, or to annex it, or at least to conquer part of it. We don't covet even 1 inch of Lebanese territory, and willingly we will withdraw our troops, all of our troops, and bring them back home as soon as possible.
So what do you think of what?
It's a nice one, especially if we look at it in hindsight, and we can establish that what he said was nonsense, because Israel went all the way up to Beirut and stayed there for 18 years.
But for a moment, you mentioned this before, it looked like Israel had achieved its aims and would be able to get out of there as international pressure and internal condemnation within Israel intensified. And many people are familiar with this story. In August, there was an agreement finally signed. The Reagan administration sent its best diplomat, Phil Habib, to the region. August 18th, there'd be a multinational force headed by France and the United States to supervise the evacuation of the PLO. So the PLO finally, Arafat finally, agrees to leave.
Ambassador Habib has informed me that a plan to resolve the West Beirut crisis has been agreed upon by all the parties involved. As part of this plan, the government of Lebanon has requested, and I have approved, the deployment of United States forces to Beirut as part of a multinational force. The negotiations to develop this plan have been extremely complex and have been conducted in the most arduous circumstances. At times, it was difficult to imagine how agreement could be reached, and yet it has been reached. The statesmanship and the courage of President Sarkis and his colleagues in the Lebanese government deserve special recognition, as does the magnificent work of Ambassador Habib.
After the siege, which had done so much damage to the suburbs there and the PLO strongholds. By September 1st, the PLO evacuation is complete.
Nevertheless, the mood is one of cautious optimism. They believe this evacuation is going to work, and the vast majority of them are ready to go. But there's no talk of surrender here, only of moving their army on to other countries to build new bases for themselves. The agreement will allow them to take their personal weapons with them, rifles, pistols and ammunition. But it is only when these last evacuees pull out in a couple of weeks that the heavy weapons will be handed over to the Lebanese.
U.S. forces withdraw. People have to remember that before the Marines were sent back where they were attacked and killed in the barracks bombing in 1983, they had been withdrawn from Lebanon. But then in late August, Bashir Gemayel, elected as or chosen or installed as Lebanon's president. 2 weeks later, he is assassinated.
Meanwhile, the number of dead and injured in yesterday's explosion, which killed President-elect Bashir Gemayel, has reportedly reached at least 60. No one yet has claimed responsibility for the bombing. Lebanon has begun 7 days of mourning for Gemayel. Shops were closed. Usually crowded streets were nearly empty.
And then an issue we discussed on a separate podcast episode a year or so ago. The phalangists seeking revenge go to the refugee camps of Sabra and Shatila, and they massacre a couple thousand Palestinian men, women, and children who were defenseless.
Beirut was a city of firing squads last night, of executions carried out against Palestinian civilians in their refugee camps of Sabra and Shatila.
Today, in the camps of Sabra and Shatila, a large plot of unmarked graves bears witness to those who died in the massacre.
Secretary Schultz helped President Reagan draft a statement that virtually blames Israel.
Israel must have learned that there is no way it can impose its own solutions on hatreds as deep and bitter as those that produce this tragedy. If it seeks to do so, it will only sink more deeply into the quagmire that looms before it.
They had been left unprotected when the PLO evacuated. It was the Israeli military that facilitated that massacre, wasn't it?
Yeah. It was impossible for the Phalange, for Bashir Gemayel's people, to do what they've done without Israeli permission. They were sent in by the Israeli Chief of Staff, Raphael Eitan, not to do a massacre, but to kill those Palestinians, armed Palestinians, the Israelis believed was still there. I interviewed Ariel Sharon on this matter. Ariel Sharon told me that he believed that in Sabra and Shatila there were 2,000 Palestinians. I remember the word he used with me in Hebrew. He said, Hamushim. He said there are 2,000 Hamushim, armed Palestinians, who were left there after the evacuation of the PLO. And therefore, this was his justification for sending in or allowing the Phalange to go in. And it was a big massacre. It was a big massacre, absolutely. By the way, Martin, Ariel Sharon insisted in the interviews, I interviewed him 5 times. He insisted that the war in Lebanon was a success. This is Ariel Sharon, not me saying I think that it was a terrible defeat, but he insisted that it was a success. The PLO was defeated, that the Syrians were defeated. I think that he was talking like Netanyahu now about tactical achievements.
These are Pyrrhic victories.
Picture.
Pyrrhic victories. Strategic disasters.
Strategic disasters, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Lebanon's civil war continued until 1990. Israel wound up occupying southern Lebanon until 2000. And the origins of Hezbollah are part of this story. Speaking of unintended consequences that flow from every misbegotten war. You know, Ahron, today, some people in the United States are justifying the war against Iran because of Iran's past support for groups like Hezbollah. Well, Hezbollah originates in this period. How do you understand the group's origins as it relates to the Israeli invasion?
Unintended consequence is just the right term to use here, because Israel went into Lebanon to solve the problem of the PLO, and they gave birth to another problem, which is Hezbollah. Hezbollah was there even before the Israelis invaded, small group, not too violent, but they were there underground. The big push to the setting up of the group was the Israeli invasion. And the moment the Israelis invaded, the Iranians sent instructors to East Lebanon, to Baalbek, to the Bekaa Valley, and there they they established Hezbollah. And in 1985, just one more thing, Martin, in 1985, Hezbollah issued its charter, the open letter, where they said, this is what we are going to do. And this charter, if you read it, in hindsight, this is exactly what they've been doing since 1982.
Armed resistance against Israel, and Hezbollah has been able to survive some serious setbacks, including in the past couple of years. It's turned out to be stronger than maybe some people expected after 2023, 2024, and when Iran really didn't do much to help it. But before we get to what's happening today, in 2006, Israel and Lebanon, there was another war, actually Israel and Hezbollah. Hezbollah is not quite a state within a state. You can even say it's part of the state. I mean, there are Hezbollah members of the Lebanese parliament. Many, if not most, Lebanese wish Hezbollah would go away or just put down their weapons, right? But that hasn't happened. Lebanon is still a very unstable country where the army, its official army, is not as strong as this militia. Where do you place the 2006 war in this chronology? How important was that? I mean, again, Israel won a Pyrrhic victory.
I want, Martin, with your permission, to go back to 2000.
Yeah, please do.
May 2000, 24th of May 2000. That's the day the Israelis, after 18 years in Lebanon, withdrew. The prime minister was someone by the name of Ehud Barak. And he decided to get out of Lebanon. He said, they, Hezbollah, are fighting us only because we are inside. If we get out, there'll be no reason for them to fight us. So let's get out. So the Israelis got out, withdrew to the border. It is called the Blue Line, the border between Israel and Lebanon. They withdrew to there. They put a fence there, a fence. The Israeli Prime Minister asked Kofi Annan, the Secretary General of the United Nations, to approve that the fence is in the right place. Kofi Annan sent his team of whatever. They said, that's fine. This is a full Israeli withdrawal. They are not in Lebanon anymore. 6 years later, Hezbollah challenged the Israelis. They crossed this fence, this border, attacked an Israeli patrol. The Israeli reaction was massive. Massive. The prime minister was someone by the name of Olbert. He had no military experience whatsoever, because by that time, Sharon, the prime minister, was very ill. The defense minister had no military experience whatsoever. The chief of staff was a pilot, knew very little about ground operation. They didn't even realize that their reaction, their massive reaction, is going to lead to war. And this is the beginning of the 2006 war.
This is where Israel's Dahiyeh doctrine comes from, to use disproportionate force in heavily populated urban areas.
Yeah. And this idea probably came from the chief of staff, who was a pilot. He probably said to the prime minister, let's turn Dahya into rubble. And they turned this neighborhood, which was Hezbollah's stronghold, into dust, into rubble, in order to deter Hezbollah. But it didn't. And Hezbollah continued to operate.
Yeah, I said Israel won a Pyrrhic victory. That's probably not right. I mean, both sides claimed victory. It's probably better to say it was a stalemate. And there was a UN resolution after this 2006 war, 1701, where Hezbollah was supposed to disarm, but that did not happen. Its political influence has increased in Lebanon. I want to share something with you, Ahron, and have you comment on it, and then we'll begin to wrap up. Maha Yahya, the director of the Carnegie Endowment's Middle East Center, gave an interview to The New Yorker where she was asked about Lebanon's internal political problems prior to October 7, 2023. She said the last war between Israel and Lebanon was in 2006. The cessation of hostilities or ceasefire that was put in place at the end of that conflict was holding. There was very little interaction along the border. In 2022, an agreement was struck between Lebanon and Israel to finalize the delineation of our maritime borders, and as for the land borders, some of the disputed points had been resolved. Internally in Lebanon, there was a power struggle between the various political parties. Hezbollah, she says, still had quite a bit of power. They were the central political power in many ways. And then you had the Lebanese government forces on the other side, who were basically the heads of various militias during the Lebanese Civil War, who had simply moved from the street into government at the end of the hostilities. There had been growing resentment of that political class within Lebanon, especially after a series of protest movements in 2019, when the country seemed to be facing economic collapse, and the protests were about how grossly the country was being mismanaged, but also that a majority of Lebanese people across all sectarian groups were fed up. So I'm sharing this with you because I'm at a loss to understand how Lebanon will finally get out of this morass, this abyss it's been in for decades.
You see, the internal, the domestic, combines with the external to cause the big problems of Lebanon. The central control of Lebanon is not strong enough because it is such a divided society. And in such a weak central control, you have groups like Hezbollah armed with their own policies. Hezbollah, for example, refuses to disarm. From their point of view, they say, we are on the front with Israel. Most of our people are in the south. And the central government in North Lebanon is not protecting them. And therefore, we should keep our arms and not move north of the Litani River and protect them. So the domestic problem there, the lack of strong government, which reflects a Lebanese politics and society, combines with the external problems. And this is the heart of the problem there.
Yeah, same as in the late 1970s, where people were so frustrated that the government seemingly was unable to do anything about the PLO incursions and then the Israeli incursions back into Lebanon. So today, Ahron, what is Israel trying to accomplish in Lebanon?
While we are talking, Martin, while we are here, sitting here, talking in a very civilized way, the Israelis are preparing themselves to invade into South Lebanon, up to the Litani. The more disturbing thing that's happening there in South Lebanon is the ethnic cleansing of South Lebanon. I want to explain this point because this is the main reason why I agreed to talk to you today, Martin. This is important.
Okay.
In the past, the Israelis always used the population of South Lebanon to put pressure on the Lebanese government. In other words, the Israelis will drop leaflets on South Lebanon saying to the people, go to Beirut. Otherwise, we will kill you, we will bomb you. We are invading. And the people of South Lebanon will leave and go. And this would put pressure on the Lebanese government to rein in Hezbollah. The Israelis are doing it again now, this moment. The difference between now and then is that the Israelis are not allowing them to come back. How do I know that? Because an hour ago, the Israelis bombed the last bridge over the Litani River. In other words, these South Lebanese people will not be able to come back to the South. Straightforward ethnic cleansing in South Lebanon. Nobody cares now about it because all of us are looking at Iran.
To what end, though? Is it to just permanently clean it out, destroy it a la Gaza so it can never be used as a base for Hezbollah operations again? I mean, is that even achievable? I guess I'm at a loss to see how this is going to end in a positive outcome for anyone.
The Israelis are doing it in order to have a clean area where they could put their soldiers in between the villages, the Israeli villages, and Hezbollah. Most of Hezbollah is north of the river. But it's easier to have the soldiers there without the population around them, because from the population, the guerrilla will come. Last time that the Israelis stayed in this buffer zone, 1985 to 2000, there was a lot of guerrilla attacks there, which was one of the reasons why the Israelis withdrew in the first place in 2000. Now there are no people there. Only Christians, only Maonites are allowed to stay.
Oh, wow.
And
is it possible? Is it possible to defeat Hezbollah?
I think that it will be too complicated. If the Israelis really want to defeat Hezbollah, they have to defeat Iran, which they are not going to do. Because the money comes from Iran, the support comes from everything is coming from Iran. This is how Hezbollah, can pay salaries, buy food. And because the Israelis and the Americans are unlikely to defeat Iran, when this war comes to an end, Martin, and we can talk about it in another discussion, when this war against Iran comes to an end, the same regime will be there. And it is likely to support Hezbollah, even if they say we are not going to support Hezbollah. And therefore, there is no way to defeat Hezbollah. And because the Israelis are now moving into Lebanon, Hezbollah have the excuse not to disarm.
At one point, probably no one thought the PLO and the Israeli government would ever shake hands and try to reach a lasting peace agreement. Yet they did in 1993, which seems like ancient history. We know it didn't last, right? But it seems hard to believe that Israel and Hezbollah would ever reach some kind of lasting accommodation where they just agree to stop fighting. I mean, that could be the best anyone hopes for out of all of this, because defeating one side or the other, obviously Israel is not going anywhere. And it's been trying to defeat Hezbollah for decades, kills its leaders, blows up its strongholds.
It's going to continue for a while, Martin. Yeah, and when we meet again, we'll probably still discuss the same story of Hezbollah, Israel, fighting against each other, invading, retreating Middle East.
You're going to have to continue to write books, adding new chapters to your one on Israel's history of wars.
Yeah.
Secretary Shultz, on my behalf, has also reiterated our views to the government of Israel through its ambassador in Washington. Unless Israel moves quickly and courageously to withdraw, it will find itself ever more deeply involved in problems that are not its own and which it cannot solve. The participation of American forces in Beirut will again be for a limited period, but I've concluded there is no alternative to their returning to Lebanon if that country is to have a chance to stand on its own feet. Peace in Beirut is only a first step. Together with the people of Lebanon, we seek the removal of all foreign military forces from that country. The departure of all foreign forces at the request of the Lebanese authorities has been widely endorsed by Arab as well as other states. Israel and Syria have both indicated that they have no territorial ambitions in Lebanon and are prepared to withdraw. It is now urgent that specific arrangements for withdrawal of all foreign forces be agreed upon. This must happen very soon.
On the next episode of History as It Happens, Gaza, we'll speak to historian Jean-Pierre Filiu about his new book, A Historian in Gaza, which documents his trip to the enclave last year. As he put it in the opening pages, nothing at all could have prepared him for what he saw in Gaza. That is next as we report history as it happens. Make sure to sign up for my free newsletter. Just go to Substack and search for History as It Happens.